guys. So also I didn't really do slides. Let's pretend that that's because I'm like some kind of free spirit and it's all fine and we'll just wing it. It's great. But if you want, if you're in need of a slide, imagine that I put an incredibly subtle sausage fest on the back wall. So my talk... Thanks, Jordan. My talk is essentially about how esports is not a meritocracy and women do not have the same access to it that men do. I thought about having like a really complicated title where it was basically just like, you know, all of esports is a meritocracy and all the men and women merely players, William Shakespeare, JK. But that didn't really work out either. So shall I just get on with it? Excellent. Thanks. Okay, but gaming is a meritocracy. That's a phrase I see and hear often attached to discussions of women's access to professional gaming. I also hear, what's an esport? Why did you capitalize the S? Holy shit, Dota players can make how much? And lol, slow news day. The meritocracy one seemed a bit more relevant to this talk. A male journalist actually made that argument to my face once at a press breakfast for a game which was trying to grow its esports scene. I'd asked the co-founder of the company whether they were looking at ways to bring women into the competitive scene, essentially whether they were going to structure their tournaments any differently, and so on and so on. There were actually 0 women competing in that particular event, and that's something which happened again and again and again and again and again, despite there being nothing in the rules that explicitly forbids women. And so, the guy stepped in before the co-founder could actually answer the question, and very kindly explained to me that actually he thought I would find that gaming is a meritocracy, and that if women were any good, or wanted to be there, then they would be competing already. And that what I was really asking for was special treatment for bad players. You can imagine how that went down. And I sometimes wonder if maybe I should have just asked the waiter over and say that I didn't actually order, you know, any patronising arsiness along with my croissant. But I didn't. This guy did, however, sum up a lot of the arguments that get thrown out when you suggest that there are any kinds of barriers to entry for women, or indeed anyone else, when it comes to gaming. Thing is, seeing gaming as a pure meritocracy involves being completely oblivious to issues like technological access, negative stereotypes, social expectations or pressures, and social inequalities which have ended up being ported into esports. What I want to do here is to flag up a bunch of these access point barriers and social issues, and then throw out some ideas about how we can counter them. Some will be more likely than others, and I should also point out that I'm going to be using women as people who self-define as women. Obviously that oversimplifies a bunch of other issues, but I'm not trying to play them down or gloss over any specific LGBT things or discriminations. The point here is to show that it's a complicated problem despite the oversimplification that I'm already indulging in. And also point out that trying to solve it will improve matters beyond seeing women represented on stage, hoping to take home a ridiculously heavy trophy. And yes, by the way, I am looking at you, Summoner's Cup. It's enormous and ridiculous, and like you've got 5 people barely able to carry it, coming into a room, you're trying to get your photo taken with them, and they're just like, seriously, please can we put it down? I digress. Okay, so let's start super early on in the process, way before specific games come into play. Now, this kind of stuff tends to get referenced in this kind of nebulous way that women sort of get access to similar technology later, or they have to have, you know, sort of hand-me-down PCs or consoles, things like that. One specific piece of information that I've seen cited in a number of talks, though, is that boys, on average, get their first computer at age 11, while for girls, it's 14. I couldn't find the original source, so if any of you guys actually know what it is, could you get in touch afterwards, because I would super like to actually read up on that. Anyway, but in terms of getting to grips with games, building up that knowledge and the muscle memory, feeling a sense of ownership or comfort in that domain, 3 years is huge. If you took a 14-year-old boy with an interest in League of Legends from this average land, he would theoretically have had 3 years of playtime on his own machine already when the girl was just getting started. Things like that are super important. On the broader side, it's because early and continued access to gaming has been linked to interest in STEM fields, so science, technology, engineering, and maths. On the specific side to this talk, a recent study showed a negligible skill gap in League of Legends ability between male and female players when they had played the same number of matches. So with that in mind, those extra years with dedicated personal access would be just such a huge benefit. And building on this point, I think also that keeping an eye on points where girls drop out of STEM-oriented activities is important, as well as keeping an eye on the actual reasons for that. By that I mean, if the girl is better at physical sports or, art or whatever, then that's fine. If they're dropping out because they don't feel like they belong there or they shouldn't be there or they're getting pressure from parents or friends, that's a different problem, and a big one. Things like talks from people who are already in the industry, women already sort of working on video games, can do a lot in that sort of sense. And schools are actually already making steps in that direction. Places like BAFTA as well, they're organising sessions which will hopefully benefit the next generation of game players and game developers. But I'm just pointing out that more can and should be done on that front. Then you come to actually getting women involved in specific games in the first place. There's an article on Polygon by Tracy Lean, which is well worth a read in full, and it's called No Girls Allowed. It explores how video games marketing ended up pursuing male demographics with the advertising you get around video games. She goes on to say, girls have always played video games, but they weren't the majority. In wake of the video game crash, the games industry's pursuit of a safe and reliable market led to it homing in on the young male. And so the advertising campaigns began. Video games were heavily marketed as products for men. And the message was clear: no girls allowed. So perceptions of those games are sometimes negative. So you get things like the Call of Duty concerns, which is probably the most obvious and the ones that you guys have probably sort of heard parroted ridiculously and felt furious in the pub and sort of tried to defend it as best you can. And you can also find games or genres with far higher proportions of female players. But broadly, you end up with this vicious circle, where because male demographics are the ones being pursued, those are the people that you end up assuming are the target market for games, they're the ones that you bring in, and then you continue to market at them. There's also the added irritant that where female players do outnumber or equal male players, you'll see those games being written off as casual or rationalized as somehow less valid. You probably saw that maybe a bit with last year's statistics essentially saying, hey, there are kind of, equal or perhaps somehow more numbers of women playing particular games, and then there were a whole sort of slew of comments sort of saying, yeah, Candy Crush isn't really a game, everyone's a filthy casual, all that kind of stuff. Something I'd like to see more of is companies looking at the research for how women do come into their games, what they get out of those games, and then responding to that. So you remember the League of Legends study I mentioned earlier. It was actually called Stand By Your Man. And one of the aspects it was looking at was women playing the game with their partners. In the qualitative part of the study, they interviewed women who play the game. There were 2 women, both had come to League via their boyfriends. One played almost exclusively with him, and the other was starting to branch out on her own, learning new roles, playing separately. There was also a quantitative part of the same study, which picked through data from more than 16,000 respondents, and women were significantly more likely to be playing with a partner than guys were. Exploring why this is the case would surely be of value in terms of targeting or increasing a female player base, as well as understanding whether there were other factors which encouraged or prevented exploration of other roles in the game, or playing outside that relationship. I mention roles because another part of that study looked at the stereotype where women end up playing support to their boyfriend's ADC. Hello, heteronormativity. I mean, you know, you get the impression that there's these people going, oh, well, darling, do you like where I place these wards? You know, doesn't that jungle look nice now? And by the way, if you let me know when you'll be back in lane, I've got a nice stun prepared, just so that you can leap into attack. But the study did find that women play more support than men do, and for female players playing with a romantic partner, that significantly predicts them playing support. And the thing about playing support, and I should know this because I play support all the damn time, is that it's not about being less skilled or having lower game knowledge. The results didn't actually indicate any lessening of competitive skill. But the thing about support is that it's seen as less prestigious. It's about not getting those rampages and godlike streaks and pentakills for yourself. It's about helping other people get those. Something I think would be useful here is developers finding a way to reward stepping outside their stereotype or their comfort zone. Maybe mini challenges that periodically encourage people to play different roles, or, if you're an experienced person bringing a newcomer in, explicitly recommending that the experienced player takes the support role. The latter actually does happen quite a lot in my experience, but perhaps it would benefit from reiterating if romantic partners are having roles and expectations assigned so early on. Hostile atmosphere also gets a mention in that study. The interviews with the female players have both reluctant to use voice chat or any engagement that isn't strictly neutral. At the risk of tipping over into anecdata, which by the way is a brilliant word that I found. You don't have to use it, you don't have to go with me on that, it's fine. Anecdata, use it. But I actually hate going on voice chat with strangers. It feels, the best way that I can describe it is it feels like a revealing act, like I'm revealing a weakness to them that they could then subsequently exploit, throw back in my face, and use against me, basically. It makes me vulnerable, wary of abuse, and of losing any sense of authority despite performing well and having good game knowledge. Even when it does go well, there's usually a moment of surprise. Someone in an intruder game that I was playing a few months ago actually just sort of said, there's a chick in the game! Who's a chick nowadays? Anyway, but yeah, so there's just that sort of that moment of acknowledgement of being other. Or sometimes unwanted attention I get from somebody enjoying the sound of my voice, asking me to say certain words again and again. Currently, I don't actually join groups of strangers on Destiny without at least one friend on mic. I don't ever use in-game voice in Dota. I would never use chat in Call of Duty and so on. It's a similar sentiment that I do see from other women. Not all, but it comes up again and again. At this point for me, there have been enough negative or frustrating incidents that the default is to say mute or silent, even if that particular game would have actually been fine. I think that's why finding ways to aggressively and effectively moderate voice as well as type chat is important. Now that can be in-game, like with Dota or something, but it can also be on official Twitch streams or in enforcing guidelines given to commentators and casters. A recent Dota event finale had a player who was casting the event use the term safe lane rapist. They get guidelines beforehand, I confirmed that with the people running the tournament, and one of their employees got in touch to tell me that the player was being reminded of the guidelines at the next available interval. But to see how gleefully the term was seized on by Twitch chat was depressing, and the usage on the official stream without any obvious repercussions appearing to sanction its place in the gaming lexicon. Sports and the trappings of sport was mentioned earlier by Chris. There are echoes of the Our Games Art debates where gaming is often seen. It feels kind of desperate for wider legitimacy almost. So sort of with the Our Games Art question, it's to be seen as a powerful medium for expressing ideas, whereas when professional gaming is involved, traditional sport is the analogy of choice. It's partly about this quest for legitimacy, so, you know, hey, we're doing something that's worthy of your consideration, and you can kind of totally recognize that it's worthy of your time because, hey, all of this other stuff that's been going on for years and years is totally worthy of your time, and we're kind of like those, it's fine, go with me. But there's also a financial aspect. Traditional sports offers a whole bunch of models that esports can look to for profitability of various kinds. And if you've sort of worked in anything approaching esports journalism, you'll know that the last year there's been a massive push for fantasy league type stuff. But what I'm seeing in esports is uncritical borrowing and aping. Almost entirely male rosters of shoutcasters, analysts, players, coaches, and so on abound. It normalizes the absence of women beyond a presenter role, and it also normalizes that divide between male and female aspects of a sport. There are exceptions, but the overwhelming number of voices awarded authority on these sports-like stages and presentations are male. Companies need to be more critical about what they borrow. I also think that there's a lot which can be done in normalizing female presence and voice via social channels, using otherwise dead airtime to show interesting plays or matches which involve both men and women, showcasing casts of official matches from the community, and so on and so on. Not segregating them off, but making them a normal and repeated part of what the official channel's voice is. And then introducing that to the pro scene at bigger events. It's also here where the second part of Awful Breakfast Man's statement comes in. As part of T.L. Taylor's book, Raising the Stakes, which by the way is awesome and you should totally read if you have any interest in the culture of esports, she broaches the subject of women's only leagues. That's something that I haven't really talked about in detail here because it was supposed to be the subject that the companion talk was going to cover. Like, I was doing sort of half of this stuff and then there was another talk that was going to be covering a whole bunch of this. But I'm touching on it ever so slightly and that's why it's not more fleshed out. Anyway, to cover the point here that I wanted to, T.L. Taylor explains that the concern is usually with women-only leagues about this unspoken economic problem, that resources and rewards can be scant in esports, and therefore squandering it on less worthy players or things that are seen as publicity stunts, or as on women who are seen to be playing gender with how they present themselves in that space is awful. So far, so familiar. The big difference, though, is that she goes on to say the ability to use women's gender and sexuality in this way is only possible because of the deeply sexist ground upon which gaming and esports is built. This isn't about the removal of individual responsibility. It's about pointing out that the finger pointing often ends up aimed at the women involved rather than tournament organisers, advertisers, team owners, sponsors, basically all of the people with power and the ability to shape the structures in play. At this point, I hit a bit of a brick wall. It's because to effect change in esports, I feel like there needs to be a financial incentive for people to change their behaviour. It's a business, and I struggle to find one. I mean, there are arguments of potential audience and healthy competition and diversity to be made, and then you look at the millions and millions of dollars already being poured into the international prize pool and feels like a big ask. It has knock-on effects for women in other roles as well. And at this point, I guess I'll tell you a bit about my experience, only briefly, and then we can go to the bar. I've been at competitive events twice now, where I've been asked, "Oh, are you his girlfriend?" about the male journalist who just happens to be standing nearest to me. Once it was by a professional player. It doesn't feel great. At another event, a male colleague and I both had interviews with pro players at the same time. During my interview, my period unexpectedly arrived, and there seemed to be nowhere at the venue to find tampons or towels, and no nearby convenience stores. Stores. I eventually had to go to an ambulance crew on the grounds and mime, and don't even ask me, mime what I needed because I didn't speak the language. And after finally making myself understood, it kind of followed a progression, kind of like the skeleton stories. Do you remember them from when you were a kid? We went down a dark, dark corridor to a dark, dark part of the arena, to a dark, dark room with a dark, dark desk and a dark, dark drawer and a dark, dark box where the tampons lived. Got back to the arena. I'd missed a game. My male colleague had watched the game with one of the pro players. I tell that story mostly because it's really funny. And because when I've had enough to drink, I do the mimes. But there's a serious point to it, and that's if I had been a spectator, I would have missed a game that a male spectator wouldn't have missed. As a journalist, I also maybe missed out on a professional opportunity. Doesn't feel great. It is one of those ridiculous eye-roll anecdotes, but yeah, like I say, serious point. And it underscores my main point, that the attitudes and behaviours which mean women are in the minority at esports events are pernicious and apparently near invisible, peppering all points of the access spectrum for gaming. It's not a meritocracy, you butthead. Now pass me the marmalade and shut up. So yeah, basically, because this was supposed to be one part of a two-talk thing, I might not be able to answer all questions, or might not be able to give anything beyond just personal experience, but if you did have questions you wanted to ask, I'm assuming there's a bit of time for that. Jake, is there? Yeah. Oh, okay, cool.
Hi. I was wanting to ask about the sort of question of like financial incentives. Now that's a very big driver for a lot of the attitudes and ways people operated. Do you think there's an obligation? Do you think there's an obligation, or perhaps a way to change things about like tournament organisers or teams, sort of like perhaps rejecting certain monetary offers or certain sponsors if they think sponsors like negatively affect the like ability of everyone to participate in it? I'm particularly thinking of an example where kind of a porn website sponsored an esports team or event.
Yeah, I think that it's on the teams individually and also on the organisers of tournaments and things, because they do actually get to decide logos and things that they will or will not show. You know, I think in League of Legends particularly, they actually have it written into their rule set, you know, things that they will and will not show and sort of include as sponsors and things. And so, yeah, there is a certain element of that involved, and I think that's the part of the talk where I said that that's where I hit a brick wall, because you can see why in an industry where finance is so uncertain some of the times that people would take those opportunities, because it's certain cash even if you're not entirely comfortable with where it's coming from. And so I guess that's why I'm reluctant to have a go at individuals' choices, because I don't know their circumstances, but I do feel that organisations can then come in and sort of take that choice out of people's hands, and they can dictate the kind of atmosphere that they want around a particular game, or, you know, the discussions that they're okay with happening, and also explain why. I think, you know, because I was talking about the Summit tournament with the Safe Lane Rapist comment, and, you know, sort of getting in touch with them and actually hearing that, yes, there are guidelines and that people do actually sort of, you know, reiterate them when something goes wrong, then fine, but you don't see that on screen, and so some of the, I think, feedback loop is lost, and so it still becomes part of normalizing that particular bit of culture, and you can actively choose to step away from it, basically. Anyone else?
Hi. Interesting talk, thank you. Yeah. I'm not a sports expert. I don't know if that's obvious or not, but
nope.
Yeah. But it seems, from my inexperienced eyes, that in some sports seem more equal in terms of sort of male and female being involved in it. I don't know, like maybe tennis seems a little bit more fairer than football. I can't say, I don't know the statistics on it. But is there anything we can possibly learn from those sports which are, or certainly appear fairer, or trying to be more fair, that we can actually implement in esports? What is it that those sports do to have a more even audience, a more even participation between competitors as well?
I don't want this to sound like a cop-out. It's more that I am not a natural follower of most other sports, and so esports is my sort of primary way of engaging with competitive play. And so I think that that is a really interesting point, and it is something that I would be interested in looking at a lot further. For example, why it has evolved the particular way that it has, you know, why it maybe doesn't seem to have quite as many of the constraints or the strict divisions, because obviously you get sort of mixed doubles and stuff, you know, whether there's a particular historical reason for that, whether it's to do with hand-eye coordination rather than physical heft, you know. So that's something that I would be super interested in pursuing further and like actually looking into and chatting to you when I have done, but I would totally be talking out of my arse if I answered it right now. Is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, it just seems that like esports has the perfect potential to be a completely balanced playing field, and
yeah, I think it's that thing of you get thrown around a lot of sort of phony theorizing about, you know, sort of men being particularly well suited to FPSs because, I don't know, hunter-gatherer brains and, you know, all that kind of nonsense that you genuinely do see in comment sections. You're like, how, really, why? And so I think that that sort of gets thrown into esports and to computer gaming where it doesn't really have a place, and I think maybe at that point it's more to do with rebutting it with particular studies, like for example the one that I mentioned earlier, which says, you know, if men and women spend the same amount of time with a thing, their skill difference is just negligible, you know. But yeah.
So it's interesting because it sounds like you're describing video games as the victim in a kind of much larger problem, because a lot of the things you describe are things I see in the workplace day after day. You know, women being uncomfortable speaking up because they feel like people aren't giving them the respect or the welcomeness to actually to talk. And you know, I work in a technology industry, so systematic, huge systematic problem. And I always feel like video games amplify culture rather than necessarily set it. I mean, to be honest, it sounds like what you really need to advocate for is more positive discrimination. And it sounds horrible and people are going to hate it, but it was the only thing that seemed to work in technology in any way, you know. And it's such it's a horrible, aggressive term that people have such a violent reaction to, but people are going to have to be prepared to lose money.
It's an interesting one, and one which is very difficult as well for the women involved, because they can't win either way. They really can't, because they are there because of a quota rather than because of ability, and that is known and that is thrown back in their face time and time again. I can only really sort of respond with my experience maybe on panels and things, because one of the things that people have argued for recently is sort of more female voices on panels, especially in tech conferences and gaming conferences and things. And being the woman who is clearly invited at the last minute,
the token person in the room, right?
Yeah, because of those reasons, is hard. It's really hard to turn up to an event knowing that you are there because they just needed someone to fill it, and I will only do it if I think that I have something valuable to add. That doesn't make it any easier, that doesn't make the repercussions any less fun, any less fun, any more fun.
Isn't the uncomfortable truth that if we don't do that, we will never see change because it will never be normalised?
I think what I'm advocating for is more to do with the people who are in the positions of power realizing what is going on and advocating to change things. And I fully appreciate that that might take a fair while, but that's why I mentioned the access points that you have at school age, you know, sort of 11 years old, like I said, for the access point for boys for a computer of their own, 14 for girls, and sort of earlier than that, you know, just sort of making sure that girls don't drop out of computer education for the wrong reasons.
It's the classic problem, isn't it? You know, I hire a lot of programmers, and you know, the simple truth is, I just don't see the women coming through, and there's only so much you can do before you actually have to start addressing education and literally parenting, cultural normalization of all this stuff, and it's just such a long journey without fighting really hard.
I think that's the worst thing about this talk, is that I don't have any answers. I'm so sorry. I wish that I did. It's more about pointing out all the different bits at which things go wrong and hoping that just by pointing them out and making it obvious that the meritocracy argument is just so untrue that that's something that can spark a change in and of itself. Was there anybody else? Did you have the guy in the cap? He's been waiting for ages.
So I hear a point about people at the top who have the power needing to change things, and I definitely do agree with that. But do you think there's anything that prominent personalities who are female in the scene can necessarily do about it? Because you see people, especially in the Dota community, I don't know how it is in other esports, but people like Shiva, people like Jess Brohard, they're essentially in the last 2 years, the two of them have been known for their legs and not necessarily what they've been bringing to the scene. Do you think there is anything that they can really do to kind of promote equality in the scene?
I think it's super frustrating. I remember, the Dota house that they had, like the cams and stuff. I couldn't actually watch that because of the chat kicking off every time a girl walked in with like just wearing shorts because it was a hot day. It was awful. But I think one of the things that women being part of the scene do just by being there is they present their own opinions. They actually sort of allow maybe guys who haven't actually seen that stuff up close before, they actually sort of show them those things and they can advocate for those things. I'm not saying that it's the responsibility of Shiva or Jess to actually sort of take on the role of representing all of womankind, because that is just some crazy task that you just can't possibly even fulfill. But it's by being present and by being sort of on payrolls and by being somebody that the employer has to consider and to sort of take into account their needs and their safety as well, then I think that at least helps raise some of that awareness and raise some of those questions as well with who can make structural change. Sure.
I just had a small addendum. It was on the Summit story about the safe lane rapist. Yeah, I should have told you this before the talk, but anywho. No, it's an addendum which was that the player who was doing the commentating and said the phrase did actually apologise on stream afterwards.
I totally missed
so
that.
Progress,
I'm so sorry,
maybe,
then. Yeah. No.
But here's a big but.
Oh really? How enormous.
In my opinion, it didn't seem that sincere. So
really?
It's just gonna like. So you're kind of getting there, but it's 2 steps forwards and 1 step back, maybe. So, but anyways, this guy's been asking a question.
In that case, regarding that point, maybe go and watch it and make up your own mind. So, addendum to talk.
Hi, yeah. So, just with tennis, which I know a little bit more about than esports, funny enough. I think with the tennis, okay, you have the men's and the women's, and then you have the mixed doubles. And the mixed doubles also almost acts as a plate. It's kind of like if you get knocked out in one of the earlier rounds, you can still join in it later on. So you've got the different mixes of sort of separate genders, and then the mixed as well. But there's a different mix in terms of like, okay, each different one is slightly differently arranged. It has slightly different rules and different dynamic. You could argue that the mixed doubles is perhaps a bit less serious, it's a bit more light-hearted, and so I think it's a case of like if you're going to have a mix of different types of tournaments with different mix of genders within that, it doesn't necessarily have to be just along those lines. You can have other lines as well that you do it along.
Yeah, I think that's what I was getting at with the fact that esports take uncritically from traditional sports and they choose particular traditional sports, and I think that by sort of thinking hard about what you take and then just moulding it to fit your community better, or sort of looking at particular game modes or particular types of tournament or particular sort of setups, you could just do a lot more differently and better and more positively. I think is that it? Are we good? Right, brilliant. I'm going over there.